Perhaps Senator Bernardi might be cautioned to take some of what he reads in the media a little more carefully into consideration rather than taking it at face value. But with regard to this cold night here in Canberra, Deputy President, I'm just going to ask those in the chamber to think about a bit of a word picture that I want to paint of a beautiful part of the country, the northern beaches. Sun, sand, surf, 7 miles from Sydney, 1,000 miles from Care, and as I stand here this evening, the seat of power, both for the state and federal governments. A bottle of Grange and a forgetful memory has seen fate chance the idyllic surrounds of the northern beaches with a Prime Minister and a Premier of their very own. Tony Abbott, the member for Warringah, the Prime Minister of Australia, Mike Baird, member for Manly, Premier of the great state of New South Wales. Surely the things that the locals have yearned for, the glory days must have arrived at last. To borrow a well-worn phrase, the good burghers of Warringah and Manly must hardly believe their new fortunes. What a hand fate has dealt them, after so many, many years of neglect, by the very party and members to whom they've shown such loyalty and who they have elected year after year, decade after decade. Surely now will be their moment of glorious spotlight in the Liberal Party ascendancy. Such prospects and possibilities with power at hand. Finally, there's an opportunity for the Northern Beaches to be front and centre of the political debate. Such great promise for such a promising area. You know, amongst the hard-working locals, from tradesmen, business owners, professionals, entrepreneurs, to the baristas that keep the whole high-paced show running, it's actually not hard when you visit the Northern Beaches to feel the sense of pride that power resides just a suburb or two away. They think, they muse, that amongst the waves of Queenscliff, during a lull between sets, the two most powerful men in New South Wales are having a yarn about local schools or health services, perhaps transport or infrastructure, and no doubt the odd quip about the real heroes of the beaches, the Manly Sea Eagles, is discussed. It's pure Camelot. Royalty by the beach even. A political union crafted in sand, held together by sea and consummated by surf. A coronation presided over at Manly Beach by Prince William and Prince Kate, with little Prince George in tow on Good Friday, no less. From the ashes of a fallen O'Farrell sacrificed on the altar of ICAC rose the golden boy of Manly, and it didn't even take 3 days. To think that if not for a bottle of wine, Premier Baird would never have been. But instead, Mike Baird turned a bottle of 1959 Grange Hermitage into a day at the beach with a royal couple, turning wine into water, and now that really was an Easter miracle. Locals watched with pride and fervour a newly ascended Premier and an avowed monarchist PM tugging politely at the forelock to Prince and Princess, the heads of Her Majesty's governments obediently escorting their sovereign's kin through picturesque surrounds.
Order.
Is it any wonder that Tony Abbott reintroduced knights and dames in such a context? Of course, despite their high office and pomp and ceremony of such occasions, locals surely hope that deep down the heart and minds of the benevolent rulers haven't strayed too far from the area that they purport to serve. At heart, the good people of Warringah and Manly hope and hold on to a vision that surely the Prime Minister and the Premier are still just local MPs. Surely they won't forget those who elected them. Surely they're going to focus at some point soon on the simple, down-to-earth problems that only a local would know and that a local would know how to solve. Questions they hope that exercise the mind of the Prime Minister and the Premier, like, is it really acceptable that the closest public high school for freshwater parents to send their boys to in Year 7 is Balgowlah? What impact will abolishing this school kids bonus have on middle-income families in Manly Vale and DY? How has the 40% price hike for My Multi ferry commuters, impacted traffic congestion on Military Road, and impacted the pockets and fortunes of those who have to pay for this increase in services. What effect, they hope these leaders in the community might be asking, what effect will abolishing the 6,500 small business tax write-off have on local industry and companies, especially the army of contractors who call the Northern Beaches their home? And they hope that questions like why is the Liberal Party privatising what was to be the new Northern Beaches public hospital? And of course, the current barbecue stoppers. Why am I going to have to pay $7 more every time I go to the doctors? $7 every time I need a blood count, $7 every time I need an X-ray, multiplied out by the number of people in my family and our burden of disease. There are countless more questions locals would like to think are being asked by their representatives, which fate has granted such high office. A hope, a belief, religious for some, that those who serve their areas should care most about the issues which face the very people they claim to represent. But sadly, Mr Deputy President, this is not happening, and it hasn't happened for a long time. I say to this chamber now what many people on the Northern Beaches already know. The Liberal Party has taken the Northern Beaches for granted for far too long. Like absentee landlords, they've allowed services to be run down. They have failed to deliver the essential infrastructure, the essential funding and facilities that the beaches sorely need and deserve. Perversely, they have done the opposite of investing in region, cutting when they should be investing and neglecting when they should be prioritising. Parents are having their school kids' bonus ripped away, making it harder to make ends meet. Families are being hit hard by the changes to family support through the Abbott hits on family tax benefits. Every commuter, every business owner, every family or young worker on their way to a part-time job is going to be slugged at the petrol bowser. Every time they fill up, Tony's long hand of tax collection will be fingering the hard-earned cash in their pockets and drawing the dollars to Canberra in a tax that the Prime Minister promised.
Senator O'Neill, I just need to remind you, you need to refer to the Prime Minister by his correct title rather than his surname or just his Christian name.
I'll endeavour to do that for you, Deputy President.
Thank you.
Every time they fill up, the Prime Minister's long hand of tax collection will be fingering the hard-earned cash in their pockets and drawing in the dollars to Canberra in a tax that the Prime Minister promised he would not inflict on the Australian people, even on the very last day before the election. And they believed him. They believed him. And everything we have seen since this government has formed is a betrayal of that trust and belief of the people in the very community in which he lives. To add insult to injury, small businesses and tradies are seeing their $6,500 tax write-off slashed, reducing incentive and ability for companies to upgrade ageing equipment and all of the productivity impacts that that has. In the next month, they meet with their accountants, and that's what tradies do. Come July, they'll be out there meeting with them, thousands of small businesses in the electorate of the Prime Minister, finding out how hollow his promises are, indeed how hollow they always were, and the depth of betrayal of trust that this Prime Minister and his government is now showing, revealed day after day, month after month, and the people are waking up to the deception to which they have been subjected. Funding for schooling. Despite the nonsense that we hear perpetrated by those opposite, funding for schooling is being cut by $30 billion when everyone knows that David Gonski got it right. His independent review, certainly a review of a very different calibre from the one we heard Senator Conroy just speaking about. This wasn't a mates all on the con job review of the kind that we've seen since this government's come to power. This was a genuinely independent review, extensive and national, truly national. It revealed what caring parents and grandparents and forward-thinking Australians know, that more money is sorely needed to help our great principals and teachers undertake the teaching, learning and ongoing professional development that will enable the next generation to be great learners, great workers and great leaders in this nation. The Prime Minister's failure to invest in education, indeed his failure or his determination to rip money out of education, is an unthinkable prospect when you consider that some Northern Beaches suburbs have the highest rates of school-aged children in New South Wales. And indeed it was put to me just this last week, Deputy President. And a question was posed. I have not yet found the answer, but I've got a feeling it was a bit of a rhetorical question. When was the last public school built on the Northern Beaches? And I've been led to believe that that is in decades since new infrastructure went into that region. Senator Dastyari made some important remarks this evening about New South Wales Government's push for privatisation. The concerns it surfaces in terms of how the community might be impacted are real and pressing. Ask the locals of Manly and Warringah, and they'll tell you that the iconic Manly ferry has been privatised, and the impact of that means that fares for many commuters have been jacked up by 40%. Forcing more people onto already overcrowded buses, increasing the traffic on the car park that is Military Road, yet the rhetoric and ideological rubbish in support of privatisation continues to spew forth from the local leaders who let down the people of the Northern Beaches day after day, despite their great trappings of power and capacity to make a positive difference. Even for their own locals, even if they neglected the rest of the country, you'd think they'd look after the people who elected them. And I can put on the record, Mr Acting Deputy President, the palpable local outrage at what was said to be a new public hospital in the region that's being flogged off to the private sector, and added into that heady and unbelievable reality of removal of public access to public health is the threat of Manly Hospital being completely closed and Mona Vale Hospital being downgraded. This litany of concerns has been very clearly communicated to me, and the Prime Minister should be very aware of the ever-deepening community disgust at the disregard for community he purports to represent. In Western Australia, or Western Sydney, or where I live on the Central Coast, if a government had the gall to close and downgrade 2 existing public hospitals, only to privatise the replacement, there'd be a riot. And so there should be, within the boundaries of the law, of course, but a riotous protest, perhaps. Local MPs would be turned out on their ear in the west or the southwest if they acted like the Prime Minister and the Premier are acting now in Warringah and Manly. But on the Northern Beaches, there has been for such a long time an absence of hard questions being asked, and the answers are even more sparse on the ground. A lack of critical media reportage on important issues like the hospital privatisation and the other matters I've raised here this evening are absolutely unhelpful. The local paper, the Manly Daily, has done much to hold the Liberal Party to account on the issue of the hospital, but the nature of the negative impact of this government incompetently and arrogantly implementing an agenda that is so far from what they told the electorate prior to the election is something which demands far greater attention from state and national media. Drawing media attention to these breaches of trust, drawing attention to the lies, the deception, the ineptitude of this government is a challenge. The absence of adequate and fearless scrutiny allows a deafening silence of local MPs in Liberal national electorates. Premier Baird and Prime Minister Abbott have the esteem of their peers in their skill in manipulation of facts. But for the rest of the community, though, their behaviours, policies and inaction on critical, life-changing investments in the people and the services of Manly and Warringah is simply obscene, and it screams of the arrogance that is the signature of this government. Surely they must be thinking to themselves, we can never lose these seats, not to Labor anyway. That's the only possible explanation for their neglect and disservice every day to the people they are supposed to be representing. People I talk to on the Northern Beaches
in my duty electorate, especially traditional Liberal voters, are at their wits' end on how to ensure their area is better served. During recent visits to these beachside suburbs, I picked up a palpable and justifiable anger about this period of neglect that has been long in the making, but is even more evident since this government came to power. People happily voiced to me at Manly Wharf, that iconic place, a growing awareness and sense that because they didn't live in a marginal area, a marginal electorate, the area that they love, that they live in, was clearly being taken for granted by both state and federal governments. I was delighted in my time visiting the duty electorates down there on the northern beaches of Sydney to visit a number of local schools and community organisations over the last couple of weeks. Amongst those schools, I was able to visit St Paul's Sports Carnival, where I talked to teachers and students and parents who were extremely concerned about the costs of the new government policy with regard to higher education. I met young people who've invested their energy, and their parents have invested significant dollars in their education at St Paul's. Young people with big hearts and big dreams, struck down with fear and anxiety about their futures as a consequence of this government's shameful budget. I never thought I would see a time in this country when we had a government that was so obsessed with its own rhetoric and ideology that it would dismantle the university sector as we know it. It saddened me and disappointed me to be in conversation with otherwise hopeful and highly gracious young students who are openly questioning, for the first time, because of this government's policy, whether they could even manage to afford to go to university. Teachers expressed great concern at the cost of postgraduate study. It will clearly be a disincentive to them to take on further debt. How can the Prime Minister show his face to the world when he's creating the context in his own backyard in which teachers and students wonder and fear that they may never be able to afford to undertake the study that will be part of improving this nation's fortunes? What we are actually watching the PM do is intolerable in my view, and inexplicable, and certainly of great anxiety to his own local people. At Brookvale TAFE, I talked to concerned teachers worried about the Baird government's dramatic increase in TAFE fees and the impact this is having on students and will in turn have on a skills shortage. What will that do to our economy? At a community, with the Tibetan community in DY, I heard the concerns of that particular community. But like all residents on the northern beaches, the Tibetan people of the area let me know about the damage they fear, like every other resident of the northern beaches, of of the Prime Minister's cuts to health, pensions and education in particular. They ask, what will this do to my family? What will this do to my community? Many of us, they say, we're on low and middle incomes. We're already struggling with the cost of living. How can the man who's supposed to represent us do this to us? To use the exact words. The Prime Minister needs to answer, and he needs to be a lot less self-righteous and less arrogant than we've seen with him of late. Yesterday, he said that his government brought down the budget the Australian people elected him to deliver. That is simply incorrect. But it is an indication of how out of touch with reality this Prime Minister is only 9 months into his service. And to prove that even more lucidly, I heard the reaction of the Northern Beaches Mental Health Support Group to the experience of being subjected to the disdain of this heartless leader. I heard concern after concern about all the issues I've mentioned here, but particularly the $50 billion cut to health funding that is now on the record, the lack of a Minister for Mental Health, as well as the Baird government's privatisation. All I can say to the good people in this duty electorate from which I have some responsibility, I will do my utmost to hold the Liberals to account. I'll support you to ensure that the Northern Beaches has a voice. It's time to send the Prime Minister a message, one that he seems to have consistently ignored and he needs to stop taking this community for granted and slashing $80 billion in health and education funding.